The smile my son's mother-in-law, Brenda, gave me was as bright and fake as the granite countertops behind her. She slid a glossy brochure across the patio table, right next to the potato salad. On the cover, a silver-haired couple laughed while playing golf. "A new chapter," the brochure read. "We just think it's time you were somewhere you could be properly looked after, Eleanor," she said, her voice dripping with sugary poison. "Leo and Chloe have so much potential, and they just can't afford to be distracted." A distraction. That's what I was to them. A problem to be managed. A line item to be moved into a neat, tidy box. They had no idea who they were dealing with. To understand how we reached that breaking point, we need to go back 3 days, to a phone call I never should have answered. That phone call came on a Wednesday afternoon, the kind of hazy, quiet day where the only sound in my workshop was the gentle hum of the dehumidifier. The air smelled the way it always did, a complex perfume of old leather, aging paper, and the faint, sharp tang of linseed oil. I was in the middle of a delicate repair on a first edition copy of Moby Dick, its spine crumbling like sea salt. My hands, stained with a faint trace of archival ink under the nails, moved with a patience learned over 30 years. These hands, with their fine network of lines and a few small silvery scars from a slipped awl, had paid for a mortgage, a college education, and a life built from scratch. They were the source of everything I was proud of, everything I had. And in a few moments, they would be the very thing my son was apologizing for. The phone buzzed against the solid oak of my work table. I saw Leo's picture flash on the screen and smiled, wiping my hands on my apron before answering. "Hey, Mom. Bad time?" His voice had a slight tension in it, a careful, high-wire quality he only used when he was about to ask for something he knew he shouldn't. "Never a bad time for you, honey. How's the big project at work?" I asked, leaning back in my chair. "Oh, it's, a lot. Deadlines are tight." He was stalling. I could picture him pacing around his immaculate open-plan office, tie probably loosened, running a hand through his hair. I heard a faint tapping sound, the nervous drumming of his fingers on his desk. He'd been doing that since he was a boy, trying to work up the courage to confess to a broken lamp or a bad grade. We talked for a few minutes about nothing: the weather, a new coffee shop he and Chloe had tried, the outrageous price of gas. It was a slow, meandering conversational dance, and I knew what was coming at the end of it. Finally, he took a breath. "So, listen, the real reason I called, Brenda and Gary are having their big 4th of July barbecue on Saturday. The whole 9 yards. It's a really big deal for them. Brenda and Gary, my son's in-laws. I'd met them only once, briefly, at the small civil wedding ceremony a year ago. My impression had been one of expensive perfume, firm handshakes, and eyes that were constantly scanning, assessing, and calculating. "That sounds nice," I said, keeping my voice even. "Yeah, it is," he said, a little too quickly. "And they really, really want you to be there. Chloe and we'd love for you to come." There it was. The nervous energy in his voice was so thick, I could almost feel it through the phone. This wasn't just an invitation, it was a summons. A test. "Of course I'll be there, Leo. What time?" He let out a sigh of relief that was so audible, it felt like a punch. "Great. That's great, Mom. It's at 2. Then, the hesitation returned. "So I might have told them a little bit about what you do." I waited. The silence stretched. "I told them you work with old books and stuff, like a preservation specialist, for museums and things." I looked down at my hands, at the faint bluish tint of iron gall ink on my right thumb. I thought of the private collectors who flew me across the country, of the universities that trusted me with priceless, one-of-a-kind manuscripts, and of the delicate art and science I had poured my entire soul into. Old books and stuff. It was like calling a master watchmaker a guy who fiddles with clocks. He had taken my life's work and sanded it down, made it small and smooth and inoffensive. He had made it fit inside a box that his in-laws could understand. "That's one way to put it," I said softly. He rushed to fill the silence, his words tumbling over each other. "It's just, you know how they are, Mom. Brenda's already planning the seating chart like it's a state dinner. Gary just bought some new imported smoker that costs more than my first car. Everything has to be perfect. They're all about impressions. Impressions. I pictured their house from the wedding photos Chloe had shown me, a vast beige suburban palace with a lawn so unnaturally green it looked like it was painted on, a place where worth was measured by brand names and square footage. A world away from my quiet, dusty workshop, where the value of an object lay in its history, its rarity, its soul. My world was about preservation, theirs was about presentation. "I understand," I said, and the terrible part was, I did. I understood that my son was caught between two worlds, and he was terrified that mine would somehow tarnish his standing in theirs. He was afraid they would see my stained hands and my practical, decade-old car and my quiet, unboastful life, and that they would see it as a reflection on him. He was afraid they would see me as a failure. "Thanks, Mom, you're the best. Just, be normal." The line went dead. I held the phone in my hand for a long time, the silence of the workshop pressing in on me. Be normal. He wanted me to be a version of myself that would be palatable to them. Small, simple, unthreatening. A nice little old lady who worked with books. A slow anger, cold and heavy, began to build in my chest. It wasn't just at Brenda and Gary and their cheap, shallow judgments. It was for my son, for the pressure they were so clearly putting on him, forcing him to apologize for the very life that had given him his own. I stood up and walked over to the climate-controlled vault where I kept my most valuable projects. I entered the combination, and the heavy steel door swung open. There, resting on a bed of archival velvet, was my current project, a letter written by George Washington, its ink faded but its words still ringing with power. I had spent a week analyzing the paper, the watermark, the chemical composition of the ink, preparing the authentication papers for a major auction house. My commission for this single piece of paper would be more than Gary's precious smoker, more than Brenda's landscaped garden, maybe more than the deposit on their perfect house. And they would never know it. They would look at me and see a simple woman, a financial lightweight, a potential burden. A new thought, sharp and clear, cut through my anger. If they were so obsessed with impressions, then an impression was exactly what I would give them, but it wouldn't be the one they expected. It was time to see if the values I had spent a lifetime instilling in my son, the values of character over cash, of substance over style, had actually taken root. It was time to conduct a little test. I closed the vault, the heavy thud of the steel door echoing in the quiet room. It was the sound of a decision being made. I would go to their perfect barbecue. I would be the woman they expected me to be, and I would let them show me exactly who they were. And so, 3 days later, I found myself driving my 10-year-old Subaru Outback into a world it clearly didn't belong in. The decision had settled in me, solid and calm. I wasn't angry anymore. I was a scientist, and this was my experiment. The neighborhood was called Eagle's Crest, or Willow Creek, or one of those other names developers give to places where they've torn down all the eagles and filled in the creeks. The houses were enormous, architectural marvels of beige stucco and oversized columns, each one a slightly different flavor of vanilla. The lawns were a shade of green that doesn't exist in nature, edged with military precision. There wasn't a single car parked on the street. It was a perfect, silent, and deeply unsettling diorama of suburban success. I found their address easily. You couldn't miss it. It was the beige palace with the most columns. Parked in the sweeping paver-stone driveway were two vehicles that looked like they had just rolled off a showroom floor. A gleaming black Range Rover, big as a tank, and a cherry-red convertible Mercedes that probably only saw the sun on weekends. I pulled my dusty, reliable Subaru, with its National Parks bumper sticker and a faint layer of pollen, into the curb behind them. It looked like a dinghy parked next to two yachts. I took a deep breath, killed the engine, and grabbed the pie from the passenger seat. The cherry pie was beautiful. The crust was golden brown and woven into a perfect lattice, with just a bit of deep red filling bubbling up at the edges. It was the same recipe my grandmother had taught me, a pie I'd baked for every one of Leo's birthdays. It felt warm and real in my hands as I walked up the driveway. The air was still, broken only by the rhythmic thwip-thwip-thwip of a sprinkler system that seemed to know exactly where the lawn ended and the pavement began. On the porch, two enormous ferns sat in identical ceramic pots, so perfect they might as well have been plastic. I felt like I was walking onto a movie set. I rang the doorbell, and a cheerful, melodic chime echoed from deep inside the house. The door swung open, and there was Brenda. She was a vision of calculated summer elegance. She wore a cream-colored linen pantsuit that was probably worth more than my car's Blue Book value, and her blonde hair was swept into an artfully effortless updo. Her makeup was flawless, her smile was dazzling, and her eyes were as cold and hard as the diamond studs in her ears. "Eleanor, you made it," she chirped, her voice a little too loud. Her eyes did a rapid, top-to-bottom scan, and I could feel them cataloging everything. My simple cotton dress from Macy's, my comfortable but well-worn leather sandals, the absence of any jewelry save my simple wedding band from a marriage long past. "It's so good to see you, Brenda." "Thank you for having me," I said, holding out the pie. "I brought this." She looked at the pie as if it were a strange, slightly alarming artifact. For a half-second, she didn't move. Then, she took it from me, holding it gingerly by the very edge of the dish with her perfectly manicured fingers. Her nails were long, square, and painted a pale, glossy pink. "Oh," she said, "you baked. How rustic." She turned without another word and glided into the house. I followed, stepping out of the bright sunshine and into the cool, air-conditioned twilight of her foyer. The floors were a polished, vein-cut travertine that looked like a skating rink. On the wall hung a gigantic, abstract painting that was mostly just angry blue slashes on a white background. It was the kind of art people buy to match their sofa. Brenda walked past a long, elegant dining table that was already laden with catered food, silver trays of shrimp cocktail, professionally arranged platters of artisanal cheeses, and a towering, multi-layered cake from a fancy bakery. She continued into the kitchen and placed my pie on a small, cluttered side counter, next to a stack of mail and a half-empty bag of coffee beans. It was a clear, unspoken message. This does not belong with the rest. "Gary's out back by the grill," she said, her back to me. "Leo and Chloe are around somewhere. Just head on through. Make yourself at home." The words were welcoming, but the tone was a dismissal. I found my son and daughter-in-law near a group of people laughing by the pool. Leo's face lit up when he saw me, but it was mixed with a flicker of that same anxiety I'd heard on the phone. He gave me a quick, one-armed hug. Chloe, however, broke away from the group and wrapped me in a warm, genuine embrace. "Eleanor, I'm so glad you could come," she said, and I could tell she meant it. She was a sweet girl, caught in the gravitational pull of her parents' world. Brenda reappeared at my elbow. "Let me get you a drink. We have a wonderful Sauvignon Blanc, or I can make you a spritzer." As she spoke, I caught a glimpse of our hands, side by side for a brief moment. Hers, pale and smooth, adorned with a diamond that refracted the light into a dozen tiny rainbows. Mine, with their faint stains and fine lines, the hands of a worker, a creator, a mother. Those hands had built a life of substance and meaning, a life of quiet, unannounced success. Her hands maintained a life of appearance. In that tiny, silent moment, the entire conflict of the day was laid bare. "Water is fine, thank you," I said, my voice calm. She nodded, her hostess smile back in place. "Of course." Tenterman. I watched her walk away toward a pristine outdoor bar. The experiment had begun, and I already had my first piece of data. I didn't have to wait long for the second piece. Just as Brenda disappeared back into the house, a man detached himself from a group laughing near the grill and headed my way. It was Gary. He was exactly as I remembered, tall and broad, with a sun-reddened face that spoke of weekend golf games and a thick gold watch that seemed to weigh down his wrist. He wore a crisp, navy blue polo shirt with a tiny embroidered horse on the chest, and he walked with the easy, rolling gait of a man who owned every room, or in this case, every blade of unnaturally green grass he stood on. "Eleanor," he boomed, sticking out a hand. His grip was firm, brief, and dismissive. "Good of you to come. Brenda tells me you've been keeping busy." His eyes flicked down to my simple dress and back up, the appraisal taking less than a second. "It's a beautiful home, Gary. You must be very proud," I said. That was all the invitation he needed. "Proud of the work we put in," he corrected me, clapping me on the shoulder and steering me toward the enormous, elevated deck. "Come on, let me show you around the place. This here," he said, slapping the thick railing with the flat of his palm, "is Trex, the good stuff." Not that cheap composite crap you see in most developments. Costs about twice as much per square foot, but you get what you pay for. Lasts a lifetime. No maintenance. I nodded, running my hand over the smooth, synthetic surface. It was warm from the sun, but it felt lifeless, like plastic. It had no grain, no history, no story. My own small porch was made of weathered cedar that I had to stain every few years, a task I loved. I loved the smell of the wood, the way it had silvered with age, the small imperfections that made it real. To Gary, maintenance was a flaw. To me, it was a relationship. He saw me as a project, a guided tour of his success. He led me across the deck to the centerpiece of his backyard kingdom, the grill. It wasn't just a grill, it was a monument of gleaming stainless steel, with more knobs and dials than the cockpit of a small airplane. A thick, fragrant plume of hickory smoke billowed from a side chamber. "Now this," he said, patting its gleaming hood like it was a prized stallion, "is my baby. It's a Sonoma 8-burner Pro, custom order, 95,000 BTUs. Infrared rotisserie, dedicated smoker box, the works. Set me back about as much as a new Kia. But hey, you can't barbecue a perfect brisket in a Kia, am I right?" He laughed loudly, and a couple of his friends nearby chuckled along with him. He was holding court, and I was his audience of one. "It's very impressive," I said. The smoke was rich and heavy in the air, a purely masculine smell of fire and meat. It was so different from the delicate acidic scent of ancient paper in my workshop. He leaned in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial tone. "So, Leo tells me you're into old books. Fix 'em up, that kind of thing?" The question was casual, but the interrogation had begun. "I'm a manuscript and document conservator," I said, using my proper title, knowing it would make no difference. "I specialize in pre-19th century paper and bindings." He squinted at me, trying to fit my words into a category he understood. A slow smirk spread across his face. "Ah, I get it. So, you're like a librarian, but for really old stuff. A cute hobby. Hope they've got a good pension plan for that." The insult was delivered with a dismissive little chuckle, designed to sting without being an outright attack. It was a verbal pat on the head, a cute hobby. I thought of the Bodleian Library at Oxford, of the private archives of the Rockefeller family, of the countless, priceless pieces of human history that had passed through my hands. I thought of the chemistry, the artistry, the deep scholarly knowledge my work required. I felt a familiar, quiet heat rise in my chest, but I kept my face placid, my smile polite. I glanced down at my hands, which were clasped loosely in front of me. He followed my gaze. I'm sure he saw what he expected to see, the hands of a woman who did fussy, unimportant work. He couldn't see the decades of skill in them, the muscle memory that could detect a forged document by the faintest change in the texture of the paper. "Something like that," I replied, my voice even. "It keeps me busy." His smirk widened. He had placed me in my box, and he was satisfied. Oblivious, he moved on. "Come on, you gotta see the pool." We walked down a set of wide steps to the stone patio surrounding a sparkling, kidney-shaped pool. A custom-built waterfall cascaded over a pile of artfully arranged boulders at one end. "Saltwater system," he announced. "Way better for your skin than chlorine. Cost a fortune to install," but Brenda insisted. The landscaping around it alone was 20 grand. You wouldn't believe what they charge for mature Japanese maples these days. I looked at the water, so clear and blue it looked sterile. I thought of the lakes I'd taken Leo to when he was a boy, their water murky and brown and teeming with life. He would spend hours chasing frogs and skipping stones. I wondered if he ever missed that kind of imperfect, natural beauty. The tour was finally over. Gary looked out over his domain, the perfect deck, the gleaming grill, the pristine pool with a look of profound satisfaction. He had shown me the full measure of his kingdom, the sum total of his worth, calculated in dollars and displayed for all to see. He turned to me one last time, clapping me on the shoulder again. "Well, it's a different world, eh, Eleanor?" he said, a note of finality in his voice. "But hey, somebody's got to look after the old stuff." He was called away then, by a friend who wanted his opinion on the stock market. I was left standing by the edge of the pool, the sound of the artificial waterfall filling the air. He had laid all his cards on the table, and they were all green. I hadn't said a single untrue word, and yet he had constructed a complete fiction of who I was. The slow burn in my chest was turning into a quiet, steady flame. The data was coming in, clear and consistent, and the experiment was far from over. The data was coming in, clear and consistent, and the experiment was far from over. I took a slow sip of the ice water Chloe had handed me, the cold glass a small, solid anchor in the sea of smiling strangers and expensive lawn furniture. I found a quiet spot in the shade of a large oak tree, content to simply observe. That's what my job had taught me, above all else, how to look. How to see the details others missed, the faint watermark on a page, the subtle shift in the color of ink that betrays a forgery, the tremor in a son's voice. After a while, Brenda floated over to the group I was near, a bottle of white wine in one hand and a crystal glass in the other. She swirled the pale, straw-colored liquid, holding it up to the sun. "Honestly," she announced to the group at large, though her eyes were on me, "I don't know how people drink Chardonnay with red meat. It's a complete amateur move. For a brisket with this kind of hickory smoke profile, you need something with enough acidity to cut through the fat, a Zinfandel maybe, or a good Pinot Noir. We were in Napa last fall, and the sommelier at the French Laundry taught us so much. It's about education, really. You have to train your palate." She took a delicate sip, her expression one of profound concentration, as if she were solving a complex mathematical equation and not just drinking fermented grape juice. The sweet, slightly acidic smell of the wine drifted over to me. It was a clean, crisp scent, but as I inhaled, it began to change in my memory, twisting and sharpening into something else entirely. It became the acrid chemical smell of archival solvent. And just like that, the bright, sun-drenched backyard dissolved. The marble patio beneath my feet became the worn, scuffed linoleum of my old apartment. The cheerful chatter of the party faded into a deep, late-night silence, broken only by the hum of a cheap box fan and the soft, rhythmic breathing of a little boy. The air, thick and humid with the memory of a Boston summer, was heavy with the smell of my work. I was 28 years old again, and my world was a small pool of intense, yellow light from a single architect's lamp clamped to a particle board desk in the corner of my living room. The rest of the apartment was dark, sleeping. On the lumpy, pull-out couch a few feet away, my 10-year-old son, Leo, was curled under a thin blanket, his face peaceful and slack in the dim light. His hair was a messy mop on the pillow, and one of his worn-out sneakers had fallen to the floor. In front of me, under the bright lamp, lay the patient. It was a 19th-century family Bible, its leather cover almost completely destroyed by fire and the subsequent water damage from the firemen's hoses. It had been pulled from the wreckage of a client's home, the only thing they had left of their grandparents. The pages were a fused, blackened mass, brittle and smelling of soot and mildew. My job was to save it, to resurrect it. My hands, younger then but just as determined, moved with a surgeon's precision. Using a microspatula, I carefully separated one fragile, water-warped page from the next. The work was agonizingly slow. One wrong move, one tremor, one moment of impatience, and a piece of history would turn to dust in my hands. For hours, I sat there, cleaning each page with a special dry-cleaning sponge, treating the mildew with a fine mist of ethanol, painstakingly mending tears with translucent Japanese paper and wheat starch paste. I was exhausted. My back ached from hunching over the desk, and my eyes burned from the strain of focusing on the minute details. But I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. Because this job, this blackened, ruined book, was more than just a project. It was Leo's future. The client was a wealthy lawyer who had heard about my specialized skills through a university professor. He had offered me a fee that, at the time, seemed like a king's ransom. It was enough. Enough to open a college savings account for Leo. Enough to be the down payment on the promise I'd made to myself, that my son would have choices I never had, that he would build his life on a foundation of education, not a bedrock of debt and worry. As I worked, I looked over at him, sleeping so soundly. He had no idea of the silent, solitary hours I poured into my work after my day job as a library assistant was over. No idea that the strange, chemical smell clinging to my clothes was the scent of his future being built, thread by thread, page by page. He just knew that his mother was always there in the morning to make him pancakes, that she always had time to help him with his homework, that their small, cramped apartment was a place of safety and love. My secret work, my exhaustion, my sacrifice, it was all invisible to him, and that's exactly how I wanted it. I was building him a life, and the scaffolding was meant to be taken down. A voice cut through the memory, sharp and insistent. "Eleanor? Did you hear me?" I blinked. The dark apartment dissolved back into the blindingly bright sunshine. Brenda was standing in front of me, an impatient look on her face. The smell of wine was back. "I asked if you wanted to try the Pinot," she said, her tone suggesting it was the third time she'd asked. "It's from a lovely little vineyard in the Russian River Valley. You probably haven't heard of it." I looked at her perfect hair and her expensive clothes and her easy, unthinking cruelty. She was talking about training a palate, about the luxury of distinguishing one expensive grape from another. And I had just been back in a time where my entire world was reduced to the smell of solvent and the desperate, ferocious love for my sleeping son. The gulf between our two realities was so vast, so profound, it was almost funny. "No, thank you, Brenda," I said, and my voice was surprisingly steady. "The water is perfect." She shrugged, a little flick of her shoulders that said, "Suit yourself, it's your loss," and turned to rejoin her conversation. I watched her go, a ghost of that long-ago exhaustion settling deep in my bones. The slow burn in my chest was no longer just anger, it was something deeper. It was the fierce, protective fire of a mother who had built an entire world from ash and was not about to let anyone, no matter how rich or powerful, dismiss its value. It was the fierce, protective fire of a mother who had built an entire world from ash and was not about to let anyone, no matter how rich or powerful, dismiss its value. I needed a moment. The sun, the noise, the forced smiles, it was all too much after the intensity of the memory. Excusing myself from the small group I'd been politely half listening to, I slipped back inside the house under the pretense of finding the restroom. The cool, conditioned air of the house was a relief. The party's cheerful noise was instantly muffled by the thick glass of the sliding doors, reduced to a distant, happy murmur. I found myself in a long hallway, decorated with a series of framed professional family photos. Brenda, Gary, and Chloe, smiling on a beach in Hawaii. Smiling on a ski lift in Aspen. Smiling in front of a Tuscan villa. A gallery of expensive, curated happiness. I was about to head back outside when I saw them through the floor-to-ceiling window of the living room. Brenda had led Chloe away from the main throng of guests to a secluded corner of the patio, near a bubbling stone fountain. She had her arm draped around Chloe's shoulders in a gesture that looked motherly from a distance. But up close, I could see the way her fingers pressed into Chloe's arm. It wasn't a hug, it was an act of possession. Chloe's head was bowed, her shoulders slumped. She looked like a flower wilting in the sun. Curiosity got the better of me. I stepped back from the window, into the shadows of the living room, positioning myself where I could hear their low voices drifting through the slightly ajar door. "I'm just worried about you, sweetie," Brenda began, her voice a low, confidential purr. "I look at you and Leo, and I see so much potential. But potential needs the right environment to grow. It needs the right soil, without any weeds." Chloe murmured something I couldn't hear, her voice soft and uncertain. Brenda's grip on her shoulder tightened. "He's a good man. I know he is. A sweet boy. But this is the real world. Sweet doesn't pay for a mortgage in a good school district. Sweet doesn't get you a membership at the country club. He needs to be more ambitious, Chloe. He needs to think about his future, about providing for you in the way you deserve." I felt my jaw clench. She was talking about my son, the boy I raised to be kind and decent, as if he were a failing stock. "He works hard, Mom," Chloe said, a hint of defensiveness in her tone. "Of course he does," Brenda cooed, stroking Chloe's hair. "But a man's future is tied to the baggage he carries. And you two, you need a fresh start. You need to be building your own life, away from all this. History. History." She said the word like it was a terminal illness. She wasn't just talking about my small house or my simple life. She was talking about me. I was the history. I was the baggage. My past, the one filled with struggle and sacrifice, and the relentless grinding work that had paid for Leo's entire education, was being rebranded as a liability. The foundation I had poured my life into building for him was now being called a weight that was holding him down. My mind flashed to the documents on my workbench: letters from Civil War soldiers, diaries from Dust Bowl farmers, first-hand accounts of a nation's painful, beautiful, complicated past. I spent my days preserving history, treating it with reverence and care, because I knew that our past is what gives us our meaning. Brenda saw history as something to be bulldozed, paved over, and replaced with a newer, shinier model. "I only say this because I love you," Brenda continued, her voice dropping even lower, becoming even more persuasive. "Think about it. What happens in 10-15 years when his mother can't work her little job anymore? What happens when she needs care? Who does that fall on? It falls on you. It falls on Leo. It's a weight, sweetie, a financial responsibility you didn't sign up for, and you two deserve to fly. You can't fly if you're tethered to the ground." The cruelty of it was breathtaking. She was painting a picture of me as a future burden, a ticking time bomb of medical bills and dependency. She was methodically, surgically planting a seed of fear and resentment in her daughter's mind. She was teaching her that love has a price tag, that family is a transaction, and that loyalty is for fools. She was doing it all with a loving arm around her daughter's shoulder. I looked down at my hands. These hands had never been tethered to anything but hard work. They had never asked for a handout. They had provided, they had built, they had saved. The idea that these hands would ever be a burden was the deepest insult of all. It was a complete negation of my entire life, of the fierce independence that was the bedrock of my soul. Chloe finally looked up at her mother. "What do you want me to do?" she whispered. Brenda's smile was triumphant. "Just encourage him to think bigger, to see the whole picture. We'll help, of course. We just want to make sure your future is secure and unencumbered." She gave Chloe a final, tight squeeze, a gesture that sealed their poisonous little pact. Then she straightened her linen jacket and, with a bright smile plastered back on her face, turned to rejoin the party. "Come on. Let's get some of that shrimp before it's all gone." I stayed in the shadows of the living room, my heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. I had just witnessed the conspiracy in action. This wasn't just snobbery anymore. This was a strategic campaign to erase me from my son's life. My little experiment, my quiet test, had suddenly become something far more serious. This was a battle for my son's heart, for his wife's mind, and for the very definition of what it means to be a family. And I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that I could no longer afford to just be an observer. And I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that I could no longer afford to just be an observer. I took a deep, steadying breath, smoothed the front of my dress, and composed my face into a mask of polite neutrality. I stepped back out into the bright, cheerful chaos of the party. The war had been declared in the shadows, but the final battle, I knew, would have to be fought in the open. I saw Brenda's eyes lock onto me the moment I emerged. A slow, triumphant smile spread across her face. She had planted the seed with her daughter, and now it was time to water it in front of everyone. "There she is," Brenda called out, her voice a little too loud, drawing the attention of those nearby. Perfect timing. Gary and I wanted to have a little family chat, just the 5 of us. She conveniently forgot that her family of 3 plus my family of 2 did not equal 5. She was already combining our assets. She led me, Leo, and Chloe to a small, cast-iron table set apart from the others, under the shade of a large, cream-colored umbrella. We sat, and for a moment, the 4 of us were an island in the middle of the party, the sounds of laughter and splashing from the pool seeming to come from a great distance. Brenda and Gary sat opposite me and Leo, with Chloe trapped between her husband and her parents. It felt less like a chat and more like an intervention, or a corporate negotiation. Gary cleared his throat and leaned forward, placing his thick, soft hands on the table. He adopted the tone of a wise patriarch bestowing a great gift upon his flock. "Eleanor," he began, "Brenda and I have been doing a lot of thinking. We're at a stage in our lives where it's not about us anymore. It's about the next generation. It's about giving our kids the kind of leg up we never had." Leo shifted uncomfortably in his seat, refusing to meet my eyes. He stared intently at a small smudge on the glass tabletop. Brenda picked up the thread, her voice filled with a practiced, theatrical warmth. Leo, Chloe, we are so incredibly proud of the life you're building together. So proud. But we know how hard it is these days. The housing market is just impossible. Getting started is the hardest part. She paused, letting the drama build. Which is why your father and I have decided we want to help. We're going to give you a gift, $150,000 for a down payment on a house of your own. It is now. The number hung in the air, stunning and obscene. I saw Leo's head snap up, his eyes wide with disbelief. Chloe let out a small, audible gasp, her hand flying to her mouth. This was the shock and awe portion of the campaign. A financial blitzkrieg designed to overwhelm any resistance. "Oh my God, Mom, Dad, Chloe stammered, looking from her parents to Leo, her face pale. But Brenda wasn't finished. She held up a perfectly manicured hand, a gesture that said, "The best is yet to come." Her gaze swiveled from the kids and landed squarely on me. Her smile was blinding. "And we've figured out a way to make it all work. A perfect plan where everybody wins. Especially you, Eleanor." "I do!" From the expensive leather tote bag at her feet, she produced a glossy, tri-fold brochure. She slid it across the table to me. It was the same one from my vision, the one I knew was coming. On the cover, a handsome silver-haired man was guiding a smiling woman's golf swing. The name of the facility was written in an elegant, flowing script. The Willows at Meadowbrook, Active Senior Living. "We want what's best for everyone," Brenda continued, her voice as smooth as silk. "And we worry about you, Eleanor, all alone in that big house. The upkeep, the property taxes, the worry of it all. We found this place. It's more like a resort than a retirement community. It has a pool, a clubhouse, social events, maintenance-free living, and peace of mind." She pointed to a picture inside the brochure. "And the best part is your house has appreciated so much over the years. It's a wonderful little starter home. If you sell it, the equity would more than cover the buy-in fee. You'd be financially secure for life, surrounded by a community of your peers." My house. The 2-bedroom bungalow I had bought with the first significant commission of my career. The house where I had painted Leo's nursery yellow. The house where his height chart was still faintly penciled on the kitchen doorframe. The house whose mortgage I had paid off, single-handedly, 7 years ago. A starter home. The words were meant to diminish it, to diminish me, to reduce the sanctuary I had built into a mere line-item asset to be liquidated for their convenience. Gary leaned in to deliver the final crushing blow, directing his words to my son. "This way, Leo. You're freed up," he said, his voice full of false sincerity. "You can take this down payment and not have to worry about your mom. No more worrying about a leaky roof in the middle of the night or a broken furnace in the winter. You and Chloe can focus on your careers, on getting ahead, on building your own future without any old obligations." There it was. The gilded cage, presented not as a prison, but as a gift. They weren't just offering my son money, they were offering him freedom, freedom from me. They had taken my son's love and concern for me and twisted it into a chain, and now they were offering him the key for the low, low price of my independence and my dignity. I looked at Leo. His face was a mask of conflict, his jaw clenched so tight I could see the muscle pulsing. He was trapped, and he knew it. They had made him a character in their play, the grateful son, and he didn't know how to walk off the stage. I looked down at the brochure in my hands. The paper was thick and slick. The photos were beautiful. The people were all smiling, active and carefree. It looked like heaven. It felt like a death sentence. Brenda's voice broke the silence, her smile unwavering, her eyes fixed on my face. "So," she said, her voice bright with expectation, "what do you think, Eleanor? Isn't it a perfect plan?" The world seemed to go silent. The distant sound of the party, the gentle bubbling of the fountain, the rustle of the leaves in the oak tree, it all faded away. There was only the weight of the brochure in my hands and the suffocating pressure of their perfect, terrible plan. The compression was complete. The silence was my answer, and it was stretching into a weapon. The silence was my answer, and it was stretching into a weapon. I let it hang in the air, thick and heavy, watching them. I could see the flicker of impatience in Brenda's eyes, the tightening of Gary's jaw. They thought I was overwhelmed, shocked into submission by the sheer magnanimity of their offer. They thought they had won. My son Leo finally chanced to look at me, his eyes pleading. He was asking me to fold, to take the deal, to make the terrible pressure just go away. And in that moment, something inside me settled. The slow burning fire of the last few hours cooled into a hard, clear diamond of resolve. The experiment was over. It was time to publish the findings. I slowly lifted my hands, the hands they had dismissed and ignored, and placed them on the table. With a calm, deliberate motion, I picked up the glossy brochure for The Willows at Meadowbrook. I stared for a second at the smiling, silver-haired couple on the cover, forever trapped in their perfect, carefree, and utterly false moment. Then, I turned the brochure over, placing it face down on the table. The back was a blank, pristine white. A clean slate. My slate. I looked up, and when I spoke, my voice was different. The soft, accommodating tone was gone. In its place was the voice I used in boardrooms and with auction house directors, a voice that was quiet, clear, and carried an unshakable weight of authority. Speaking of valuable assets with complicated ownership, I began, my gaze landing on Brenda. You're a top agent in this area, Brenda. You must have heard the news about the Hawthorne letter that just went to private auction. The change in topic was so abrupt it was like a physical blow. Brenda blinked, thrown completely off balance. I could see the gears turning in her head as she shifted from condescending matriarch to sharp-witted realtor. She didn't want to admit ignorance. The Hawthorne letter? She repeated, a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. It sounds vaguely familiar. There are so many high-end sales. Of course, I said, giving her a gracious exit she didn't deserve. It was handled very quietly, a newly discovered personal letter from Nathaniel Hawthorne to his sister, pre-publication of the Scarlet Letter. The content was revelatory. The initial valuation started at $1 million, but the collectors who got wind of it were prepared to go much, much higher. I saw a flicker of avarice in Gary's eyes. He leaned forward, his interest piqued. A multi-million-dollar asset was a language he understood. So what was the problem? He asked. The problem, I said, tapping one finger on the back of the brochure, was that it was almost declared a forgery. A very, very good one, but a fake nonetheless. Worthless. Leo and Chloe were watching me, their expressions a mixture of confusion and awe. They had never seen this version of their mother before. This was not the quiet woman who baked pies and wore sensible shoes. This was someone else entirely. The auction house, a very prestigious one, had their top people look at it, I continued, keeping my tone educational, as if I were a professor lecturing a particularly slow class. The paper was perfect 100% rag content, consistent with the 1,840 seconds. The handwriting was a near-perfect match to known samples. The signature was flawless. Everything checked out, except for one tiny detail. I paused, letting them lean into the story. They had forgotten all about their generous offer, about my little starter home, about my future in their gilded cage. They were completely and utterly hooked by a story about money. The ink, I said simply. When they ran a chemical analysis, the composition of the iron gall ink was slightly off. It had trace elements that, according to their records, weren't common in American-made inks of that period. So, they concluded it had to be a modern forgery. They were ready to issue a press release to save themselves the embarrassment of having been fooled. The sale was canceled. Brenda frowned, shaking her head. A shame, all that money gone. She was seeing it only in terms of a lost commission, a failed transaction. But it wasn't gone, I said, and my voice was sharp now, cutting through the air. Because they made one final call to an outside consultant, someone who understood that value isn't always obvious, someone who knows that history is more complicated than a simple chemical test. I looked from Brenda's confused face to Gary's greedy one. I saw my son watching me, his mouth slightly agape, as if seeing his own mother for the very first time. This consultant, I said, savoring the moment, knew something the auction house experts had overlooked. She knew that for a brief 2-year period, Hawthorne's favorite supplier in Boston had imported a specialty batch of ink from a small workshop in Lyon, France. An ink that happened to contain those exact trace elements. It wasn't a forgery. It was just a piece of history so rare, so specific, that only a true expert would ever recognize its authenticity. I let the story settle in the quiet space between us. The sounds of the party seemed to rush back in, a strange, faraway echo of a world that no longer concerned us. The power dynamic at our little table had not just shifted, it had been completely and irrevocably reversed. They thought they were listening to a dry, historical anecdote about a dead author. They didn't understand. They were listening to my resume. But they were too arrogant, too insulated by their own perceived success to understand it. They saw me as a storyteller, a purveyor of quaint historical tidbits, a harmless old woman with a dusty little hobby. They were still waiting for me to get to the point, to answer their question, to accept their generous, suffocating offer. Gary was the first to break the spell. He let out a short, impatient huff and leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms over his chest. It was a gesture of pure, dismissive power. He was done with the games. "That's a real interesting story, Eleanor. A real nail-biter," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "But I gotta ask, what's the point? What in the hell does a story about some dead guy's mail have to do with this very generous, very real offer we're making to our kids?" Brenda chimed in, her voice regaining its syrupy condescension. "Gary's right, Eleanor. It's a lovely little tale, but we're talking about your future here, about your comfort and security." That was it, the final dismissal. The final, arrogant wave of a hand, brushing aside my entire life's work as a lovely little tale. The slow burn was over, the fuse had reached the dynamite. I folded my hands on the table, on top of the blank side of their brochure. I looked directly at Gary, and I held his gaze until he started to look uncomfortable. "My point, Gary," I said, and my voice was as cold and hard as the ice in my water glass, "is that a thing's true value is often only understood by the one person in the room who knows what they're looking at." I shifted my gaze to Brenda. "That letter was sold 2 months ago in a private deal. The final price was $2.5 million. The number landed on the table with a physical weight. I saw Brenda's perfectly plucked eyebrows shoot up. Gary uncrossed his arms and leaned forward again, his mask of boredom replaced by a naked, hungry curiosity. $2.5 million, Gary breathed. "For a piece of paper." "For a piece of history," I corrected him. And the anonymous consultant who saved the sale, the true expert as the auction house called her, earned a standard 15% commission for her services. It's the industry rate for a high-risk authentication of that value. Perfect is in to state from the starting. In the motion and in 274s, and the motion and it kerchi to the botter promuf. I didn't need to do the math for them. I could see their minds working, their eyes glazing over as they calculated the number that was bigger than their down payment, the number that was bigger than the annual profit from one of Gary's car washes. Brenda stared at me, her mouth slightly open, the perfect lipstick suddenly looking garish. But who was it? Who was the expert? I let the silence hang for one final perfect beat. I looked at my son, who was watching me with a look of dawning, impossible hope. I looked at Chloe, her face a pale, frozen mask of shock. Then I looked back at Brenda and Gary, the architects of my humiliation. And I gave them the point of my story. I said. The words were quiet, but they landed with the force of a thunderclap. I was the consultant. Your cute hobby, Gary, earned me $375,000 in 1 week. Silence. A profound, absolute silence that seemed to suck all the air from under the umbrella. The cheerful party noise from the rest of the yard vanished. The world shrank to the space between the 5 of us. I watched as Gary's smug, florid face seemed to collapse in on itself. The color drained away, leaving behind a pasty, sickly gray. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. Brenda's hand, which had been gracefully holding her wineglass, was frozen in midair, her knuckles white. She looked as if she'd been turned to stone. Before they could recover, before the denial and disbelief could find a voice, I calmly reached into my purse. I took out my phone, unlocked it with a simple swipe of my thumb, and tapped the screen a few times. I didn't say a word. I simply placed the phone on the table and slid it across the smooth, cool surface toward them. On the screen was an article from the Forbes website. The headline read, "The $1 Million Letter, How One Unnamed Expert Rewrote History and Rocked the Art World." The article detailed the entire story I had just told them, complete with quotes from the director of Sotheby's. I had already highlighted a key sentence for them. It read, We owe the discovery to the unimpeachable eye and encyclopedic knowledge of the world's foremost manuscript conservator, whose anonymity we are fiercely committed to protecting. My name wasn't there, but my title was. I slid the phone across the table. Then, I flattened my palms on the cool iron, one on each side of the face-down brochure. I looked at my hands, the source of it all. Then I looked up at them. Their eyes were glued to the phone screen. Then they flickered up to my face, then back to the screen, as if trying to reconcile two completely incompatible realities. The quiet woman in the department store dress, and the world's foremost expert who commanded six-figure fees. The feeling that washed over me wasn't triumph. It wasn't the sweet taste of revenge I might have expected. It was a cold, clean, and profound sense of peace. It was the feeling of a spine that had been bent for hours finally straightening. The truth was out. It was on the table, glowing under the afternoon sun, and it was irrefutable. They were still silent, their faces a ruin of shock and humiliation. Their entire world, a carefully constructed hierarchy built on the simple, brutal math of money, had just been demolished. And the person holding the hammer was the one they'd dismissed as a footnote. They had tried to write the story of my life. They had no idea I was the one who authenticated the ink. They had tried to write the story of my life. They had no idea I was the one who authenticated the ink. The silence that followed was a physical thing. It pressed down on us, heavy and absolute, warping the cheerful summer air under the umbrella into something cold and suffocating. I watched the truth land on them, not as a single impact, but as a series of internal explosions. I saw it in the way Brenda's carefully constructed hostess smile seemed to crack and freeze on her face, becoming a grotesque, painted-on grimace. I saw it in the way Gary's ruddy, confident complexion turned the color of old parchment. He looked from the glowing screen of my phone to my face and then back again, his mind, so accustomed to simple addition and subtraction, utterly failing to compute the new reality. He was the first to find his voice, because a man like Gary cannot tolerate a universe in which he is not in control. His ego, bruised and battered, lashed out in pure, sputtering denial. "No," he choked out, shaking his head. "No, I don't believe it. This is some kind of trick. A joke." He looked wildly at Leo, as if my son could offer him an escape hatch. "She's making this up, right? This is a gag." Leo, however, was just staring at me, his eyes wide. He wasn't seeing a trick. He was seeing the answer to 1,000 tiny mysteries from his childhood. My strange working hours, the chemical smells on my clothes, the reason we lived simply, even when other families were buying bigger houses and fancier cars. He was seeing the truth, and it was rendering him speechless. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I let Gary's pathetic denial hang in the air for a moment, letting its weakness become apparent to everyone at the table. Then, I leaned forward, just an inch, and spoke directly to him, my voice as calm and precise as if I were describing the molecular structure of paper fiber. "A trick, Gary? Do you really think I have time for tricks?" I asked. "Let's not be ridiculous. Let's talk about something you understand. Let's talk about business." I paused, letting him know that the topic of conversation was no longer his to command. "The investment firm that brokered the private sale of the Hawthorne letter is a boutique outfit out of New York," I said. "They're called Crestwood Capital. I'm sure you've heard of them." At the name, I saw a flicker of recognition and then dawning horror in Gary's eyes. He knew the name. Oh, he knew it very well. I continued, my voice relentless and steady. "Crestwood specializes in managing funds for what they call unique tangible assets. Old letters, fine art, classic cars, your strip malls." The color that was left in Gary's face completely vanished. He looked like he had been punched in the gut. "The CEO of Crestwood Capital is a man named Charles Abernathy," I went on, twisting the knife with cold, factual precision. "An old client of mine. I restored his family's 18th century land grants last fall. A fascinating project. He was so pleased with the result that when Crestwood managed the Hawthorne sale, he called me personally to thank me. We had a lovely chat. He mentioned that his firm had recently taken over the financing for a portfolio of commercial properties in this very state. A chain of car washes, I believe he said." Gary made a small, strangled sound in the back of his throat. He was a man who lived and died by leverage, by who owed who, by the delicate balance of debt and power. And he had just realized that the quiet, insignificant woman he had dismissed as a librarian with a cute hobby was a personal acquaintance of the man who held the notes on his entire strip mall empire. He had just realized that with a single quiet phone call, I could cast a shadow of doubt over his reputation that could complicate his financing for years to come. He had just realized that he had spent the last hour insulting his banker's best friend. He didn't see me as a woman anymore. He saw me as a risk, a threat, a column of red on his personal balance sheet. He visibly deflated, his broad, confident shoulders slumping. The king had been checkmated, and he had never even seen the board. With Gary utterly and completely silenced, I turned my calm, unblinking gaze to Brenda. She was staring at me, her mind racing, the realtor inside her frantically reassessing the value of every single thing at the table, including me. She was no longer looking at a poor relation. She was looking at a power player, a networking opportunity, a threat of a different kind. "Reputation is a fragile thing in your business, isn't it, Brenda?" I said softly. "It's all based on perception, on who you know, and more importantly, on who knows you." I didn't need to say anything else. She understood. The story of this afternoon, if it ever got out, would make her look like a fool. A greedy, misjudging, classless fool. And in her world of country clubs and charity galas, that was a fate worse than bankruptcy. Finally, I looked at my son. The anger and coldness in me melted away, replaced by a deep, aching sadness. He looked broken, caught in the wreckage of the life he thought he wanted. I had just blown up his world to save him from it, and I didn't know if he would thank me or hate me for it. The silence returned, but this time it was different. It wasn't tense. It was the dead, empty silence of a battlefield after the fighting is over. With a simple, quiet gesture, I reached out, picked up my phone, and slipped it back into my purse. The evidence was no longer needed. The verdict was in. I left the brochure for the willows at Meadowbrook sitting in the middle of the table, face down. A small, white tombstone marking the grave of their perfect, ugly plan. A small, white tombstone marking the grave of their perfect, ugly plan. It sat there between us, a monument to their spectacular miscalculation. The air was thick with the things that had been said, and the things that were now impossible to say. Gary looked shrunken, his bravado gone, leaving behind a pale, sagging emptiness. Brenda's face was a mask of cold fury, her mind clearly scrambling to find a new angle, a new strategy, but coming up with nothing. They were generals without an army, kings without a kingdom. And in that dead, still air, a new sound emerged. A small, sharp scrape of a chair leg against the stone patio. All eyes snapped to Chloe. She was standing up. Her hands were pressed flat on the table, and she was trembling from head to toe, but she stood tall. Tears were streaming, unchecked, down her cheeks, but her expression wasn't one of weakness. It was one of terrible, dawning clarity. She looked at her parents, truly looked at them, and it was as if she was seeing them for the first time without the filter of lifelong obedience. "My God," she whispered, her voice cracking with a pain so deep it was almost primal. "My God. All my life." Brenda's mask flickered. A hint of maternal concern, however false, crept back into her voice. "Chloe, sweetie, sit down. You're overwrought. This has been a shock for all of us." "No," Chloe said, and her voice was suddenly stronger, cutting through her mother's placating tone. "I'm not overwrought. I'm awake." She turned her gaze on her mother, and the look in her eyes was one of profound and heartbreaking betrayal. "All my life," she repeated, her voice gaining strength, "you've been teaching me. You taught me which labels to wear, which forks to use, which neighborhoods were acceptable and which ones were up and coming. You taught me the precise monetary value of every single thing in this house. You taught me the price of everything." She took a ragged breath, her eyes flicking to me for a brief, apologetic second before returning to her parents. "But you never taught me the value of anything, not one single thing." The accusation, so simple and so complete, hung in the air. Brenda recoiled as if she'd been slapped. "You judged her," Chloe said, her voice rising, pointing a trembling finger toward me. "You judged her the second she pulled up to the curb in a 10-year-old car. You judged her dress because it didn't come from a boutique. You judged her homemade pie because it wasn't catered. You looked at a lifetime of quiet, brilliant, back-breaking work, and all you could see was a cute hobby and a little starter home." Her voice broke on a sob, but she pushed through it, fueled by a righteous, newfound anger. "You taught me to build a life that looks good, not one that is good. You taught me how to build a house of cards, Mom. A beautiful, empty house of cards. And you just tried to bulldoze the only real thing in the room to build another floor." Brenda, finally recovering, reached for her purse. Her movements were stiff, jerky. "You're being hysterical, Chloe. We did this for you. We were trying to give you a gift." From a pristine white envelope, she pulled out a check and slid it across the table. "This is for your future." Chloe looked down at the check. I could see the number written in Brenda's perfect, flowing script. $150,000. It was the key to the kingdom they had promised her. It was security. It was status. It was everything she had been raised to want. With a steady hand, she reached out and pushed the check back across the table. It slid to a stop directly in front of her mother. "No," she said, her voice now eerily calm. "That's for your future, not ours. We don't want it. We'll build our own life, the right way." That was it. The final act of rebellion. The rejection of the creed she had been raised on. Brenda and Gary stared at the rejected check, then at their daughter, their faces a mixture of disbelief and fury. They could not compute it. They could not understand a world where their money had no power. They were looking at their own child as if she were a stranger speaking a foreign language. And then, Leo moved. He had been a statue this whole time, a spectator at his own execution. He pushed his chair back, stood up, and walked around the table to Chloe's side. He didn't say a word. He just took her hand. It was a simple, silent declaration of allegiance. He had made his choice. He had chosen his wife. He had chosen my world. I watched them, my son and his wife, standing together against the ruins of her parents' ambition. And the last of the cold anger in my heart finally melted away, replaced by a wave of fierce, overwhelming pride. This was the true payback. Not the humiliation of Brenda and Gary, not the validation of my own success. It was this moment, the moment my son, faced with the choice between a life that was easy and a life that was right, chose what was right. The values I had quietly woven into the fabric of his childhood, the lessons I thought he might have forgotten, had held. The foundation was strong. The four of them stood on one side of the table, a family broken and remade, and I sat on the other, a quiet witness to it all. The battle was over. In the center of the table, the rejected check and the useless brochure lay side by side. An offer and a cage, both now worthless. An offer and a cage, both now worthless. They sat on the table like artifacts from a forgotten civilization, their power utterly extinguished. The spell was broken. I looked at the stunned, hollowed-out faces of Brenda and Gary, and for the first time all day, I felt a flicker of something almost like pity. They were trapped in a prison of their own making, a beautiful, expensive prison where everything had a price and nothing had any value. They would never be free. I pushed my chair back, the soft scrape of the metal on the stone sounding like a gavel in the silence. It was time to go. My work here was done. As I stood, Leo turned to me, his face a mess of shame and awe and a dozen other emotions I couldn't name. "Mom," he whispered, his voice thick. "Mom, I am so sorry. I had no idea. I made you feel." I reached out and put my hand on his arm. My real hand, my worker's hand. He flinched slightly, not from my touch, but from the weight of his own regret. "You have nothing to apologize for, Leo," I said, and I meant it with every fiber of my being. "You were raised to be a good man, to be kind, to be respectful, to see the best in people. You were raised to value a person's heart, not their portfolio." I squeezed his arm gently. "Today, you just got a very hard lesson that some people never learn that. It's not your fault you have a good heart. In fact, it's the thing I am most proud of." His eyes filled with tears, and he nodded, unable to speak. Chloe, her hand still in his, looked at me with a gratitude so profound it was humbling. "Come on," I said softly. "Let's go home." The three of us turned and walked away from the table, leaving Brenda and Gary sitting there like statues in their own personal museum of failure. We walked past the smiling, oblivious guests, past the gleaming stainless steel grill, past the ridiculously perfect waterfall. No one said a word to us. I think they could feel the invisible perimeter of our new, forged-in-fire family unit, and they knew not to cross it. As we passed through the pristine cold kitchen on our way to the front door, I saw it, my cherry pie. It was still sitting on the cluttered side counter where Brenda had exiled it, a lonely, homespun thing in a world of store-bought perfection. It was a perfect pie, baked with love and memory and 60 years of my grandmother's wisdom, and it would go uneaten. A small silent testament to the fact that they were starving, not for food, but for the very things they couldn't buy. We stepped out into the bright, late afternoon sun. The air felt cleaner out here, lighter. We walked down the long, paved driveway, past the Mercedes and the Range Rover, two gleaming symbols of a life I would not trade for my own for all the money in the world. We got to my Subaru, my trusty, dusty adventure mobile, and it looked more beautiful to me than ever before. It was real. It was paid for. It was mine. Leo took the keys from my hand without asking, and I let him. He needed to do something, to take some small action to reclaim himself. He drove us away from Eagle's Crest, away from the land of beige palaces and perfect lawns. Chloe sat in the back, quiet, her hand resting on the back of my seat. The silence in the car wasn't awkward. It was peaceful. It was the comfortable, healing silence of a fever that has finally broken. As we drove, I looked out the window at the normal, beautifully imperfect world passing by. Houses with toys on the lawn, people walking their dogs, a teenager trying to skateboard on a cracked sidewalk. Life, messy, real, and glorious. Brenda and Gary had wanted to give my son a down payment on a house, but in the end, they had given him something far more valuable, a down payment on a life of his own. They had shown him, in the ugliest way possible, the gilded cage he was about to walk into, and in doing so, they had given him the motivation to break free. True wealth isn't something you can show off. It's not about the car you drive, the house you own, or the labels on your clothes. It's about the quiet, unshakable knowledge of your own worth. It's about building a life, not just an image. It's about having a foundation so strong that no amount of judgment or condescension can ever make it crumble. It's about the freedom to be who you are, without apology. So let me ask you, if you discovered that the life you were chasing was just a beautiful, empty house of cards, would you have the courage to walk away and build your own? If this story resonated with you, let us know your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories about finding strength when it matters most.